Welcome to The Beat. I'm Melissa Murray in for Ari Melber. We're tracking several developing stories, including a big legal setback for Donald Trump. Late today, the Georgia Supreme Court rejected his efforts to disqualify the Fulton County probe into 2020 election interference. We'll have more on that ahead. But we begin tonight with bracing revelations about Donald Trump's scheme for an historic power grab, as his allies plot a second Trump term with few guardrails against what critics say would be an imperial presidency. The New York Times is reporting today on the far-reaching plan cooked up by some of the same right-wing election deniers subpoenaed by special counsel Jack Smith. As the Times puts it, the plan would be a, quote, sweeping expansion of presidential power over the machinery of government, reshaping the structure of the executive branch to concentrate far greater authority directly in his hands. Under the plan, Trump would bring, quote, independent agencies under his control. He would revive the practice known as impounding of refusing to send money appropriated by Congress. Impounding has been banned since the days of Richard Nixon. And more chillingly, Trump intends to strip employment protections from tens of thousands of career civil servants, making it easier to replace them if they are deemed obstacles to his agenda. Opponents are warning that this is the playbook of a would-be tyrant, a playbook made all the more dangerous by the MAGA cult of personality. Speaking of, Trump's followers turned out in impressive numbers this weekend at a conservative gathering, booing and heckling Trump's GOP primary foes.
I am delighted to be here today. Those like-minded folks that can support us to win in 2024.
They got a tragic figure on there right now. Governor Ron DeSantis. He's a tragic figure.
And fighting for the conservative cause. Young people, you are leading the charge that's ahead. I just finished 8 years.
Tough crowd. Trump's apparent scheme to amass power grows out of seeds planted by leading MAGA figures. Steve Bannon has long expressed interest in what he terms, quote, the destruction of the administrative state.
The deconstruction of the administrative state, which is a huge element. Right-wing populism is about deconstruction of the administrative state, the deconstruction of the administrative state, all of that, all the real work.
Deconstruction of the administrative state. And if you...
This is taking on and defeating and deconstructing the administrative state.
There's a long way to go before the 2024 election, but today's reporting raises the stakes as Trump widens his lead in the GOP primary, despite indictments in multiple jurisdictions. Joining me to discuss it all is Rick Wilson, former GOP strategist and co-founder of the Lincoln Project. He's also the host of the Enemies List podcast. Also with us is Eugene Robinson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist with the Washington Post. So Eugene, what are your thoughts on the prospect of Trump increasing executive power?
Well, I don't see anything good coming of that. Look, conservatives have complained for a long time that the what they call the administrative state and what's really the hardworking and very talented people who work for federal agencies, that the administrative state has run amok, and they've proposed various reforms and attempts to, as they see it, rein it in. This is something different. This is an attempt to take control for political reasons and for the reasons of amassing power by a president, by the White House, and to take it away from agencies and to essentially, in many cases, keep them from doing what it is their mission to do. One imagines what he would do, for example, with the Environmental Protection Agency. If you live here in the Washington area, you know a lot of people who work for the federal government, some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, who could be making a lot more money if they had decided to work in the private sector. But instead, they decided to become political public servants, and those are the people whose heads are apparently on the chopping block if Trump wins again.
So, Rick, Eugene makes a great point here. Conservatives for a long time have had nothing but antipathy for regulation and for the administrative state. But this feels somewhat different. Is this just generally conservative objections to the administrative state, or is there particular dangers about a potential second Trump term?
You know, I think there's a little bit of a semantic problem wrapped up in all this. Is traditionally conservatives believe that individual liberty and limited government in a sort of broad philosophical way. These people are not limited government conservatives. They are unlimited government conservatives. They seek to use the power of the government to hurt their enemies. They seek to maximize the power of the state, of the federal government, of the bureaucracies, not simply to prevent things from happening that they don't like, but to aggressively harm people that they believe are their political enemies. You're seeing it play out in places like Florida with Ron DeSantis, in Texas with Greg Abbott, in a variety of places where MAGA governors and Republican governors, they're pre-gaming what Trump would do at a much grander scale. And this is not about a conservative principle. It's an authoritarian principle. It's an oppression-based governance system. And remember, they tell you in advance what they're going to do. They're laying all this out because they're predicting that they're going to win, and they're starting to try to scare people that if you don't get on board with them, they will turn the power of the entire U.S. government against you.
Gene, speaking of the power of the entire U.S. government, I can't help but notice that the dismantling of the administrative state and the rhetoric associated with that dismantling comes on the heels of a series of Supreme Court decisions that explicitly undermine the authority of administrative agencies. Is this merely a coincidence from the High Court, or is this conservative supermajority normalizing the prospect of a revamped administrative state, whether under Donald Trump or some other Republican?
Well, look, whether this Supreme Court majority would go as far as a second Trump administration would likely go in the authoritarian direction that Rick was talking about, I'm not sure about that, but it does seem to me that the recent Supreme Court trend with this majority has been to enable that sort of move by Trump, to empower it, to make it easier, to make it more conceivable that he could use the government in this authoritarian way. And Rick is absolutely right. He wants to go after his perceived enemies and help his perceived friends. And that's the other side of the coin.
So, Rick, you were just talking about the Republican Party, which you know very well. This is a party of conservative principles. They've talked about checks and balances, limited government. This imperial presidency is the exact opposite of those values. What is the allure for mainstream Republicans for this brand of conservatism? Eugene, do you have any thoughts, Eugene, about what's the allure of all of this? We know that these are not conservative values, but why are they so appealing to so many in the MAGA camp?
Well, I think what's appealing to so many in the MAGA camp is Donald Trump. I think a lot of people who are devoted to him and to trying to reelect him see him. I won't use the word savior, but see him as their salvation, as their rescuer. They see themselves as sort of shut out of modern America, and they see him as somebody who's fighting for them, and they're willing to forgive him almost anything and to go with him almost anywhere. And so if he says, no, this is the problem, it's those pointy-headed intellectuals, those scientists, those doctors, those PhDs who work for the government who are your problem, then they're willing to go there. But it all, for that group, comes back to Trump. I don't think it comes from any deep-seated views about the administrative state.
So, Rick, that's kind of ironic. So this idea that mainstream Republicans, or these MAGA Republicans now, are so enamored of Donald Trump because the more people work with him, the more disenchanted they become. So his former chief of staff, John Kelly, said that this alleged plan to restructure the government would actually trigger chaos. He said it just simply would be chaotic. because he'd continually be trying to exceed his authority, but the sycophants would go along with it. It would be a nonstop gunfight with the Congress and the courts. What's your reaction? Eugene, I think we've lost Rick again. What's your reaction to this? Like, the more you know him, the more you fear him, it seems.
Well, the more you know him, the more, in my opinion, you should get determined that he never again sit anywhere near the Oval Office, because, yes, it would be a nonstop fight. The president has a lot of power and a lot of the authority that has been given to federal agencies because they have the expertise and the experience to know better than the politicos in the White House how to handle a certain issue. A lot of authority was given, but not in a way that it necessarily couldn't be taken back. So yes, there would be court fights, and yes, there would be fights in Congress, and we'd have to see what the composition of Congress looked like, and what the courts had to say about it. But it would be a mess, and it would be detrimental, I think, to the functioning of the modern United States of America. We're a great, big, complicated country, and we need a great, big, complicated government, whether folks like it or not, and that's what we're ultimately going to have. But it would be a mess if Donald Trump tried to do what this reporting says he's going to try to do.
I'm going to leave you with the last word, Eugene. Many apologies to Rick Wilson for those technical difficulties. Eugene, as always, thank you for your time. Coming up, we have lots of breaking legal news. The Georgia Supreme Court has a big ruling on Trump's, quote, Hail Mary attempt to stop the coup probe in that state. But first, Jack Smith sends a warning shot to Donald Trump just hours before the first key hearing in the classified documents case. And we're learning more about Rudy Giuliani's sit-down with the DOJ as part of the January 6th probe. All that and more when we're just back in 60 seconds. There's breaking news out of Georgia. The state Supreme Court has denied Trump's petition to disqualify Fulton County DA Fani Willis after she seated a grand jury to hear any criminal charges surrounding his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. But we're just hours away from the first key hearing in another suit, Donald Trump's classified documents case, with arguments about when and how this trial is going to be conducted. The judge told both sides to be ready to argue for and against delaying the trial. Special counsel Jack Smith is also moving ahead with a new filing proposing a protective order for the classified information in this case. The filing includes a warning to Trump that any violations of the order could result in contempt of court and, quote, possible referral for criminal prosecution, as well as the termination of his access to classified information. Now, of course, Judge Cannon would need to sign off on such a measure. But over the weekend, Donald Trump took the unusual step of talking about Judge Cannon, whom he appointed.
She's very smart and very strong and loves our country. Loves our country. We need judges that love our country so they do the right thing.
Meanwhile, we're learning new details about Jack Smith's other investigation into January 6th. Specifically, we've learned about that proffer session with Rudy Giuliani. New reports are indicating that Giuliani voluntarily spoke with the special counsel's office over 2 days, not one, as previously reported. Giuliani's attorneys claimed that this had to do with scheduling conflicts, but experts agree that this is not standard. Former Trump White House attorney Ty Cobb says it suggests that DOJ may be considering Giuliani's value as a witness. Joining me to discuss is now Nick Ackerman, former Watergate prosecutor. So, Nick, what's your reaction to the breaking news about the Georgia Supreme Court rejecting Trump's bid to stop that probe?
I am not at all surprised. There is no way they were ever going to remove Fani Willis as the DA, or they were going to stop that investigation. That would be so unprecedented on so many levels. As a basic matter, the courts do not get involved in stopping grand jury investigations or in inserting themselves into grand jury investigations. The thought normally is if a defendant has a beef with something that occurred in the grand jury or something else that occurred in the investigation, time to bring it up is after an indictment when there's a trial in pretrial motions. So I'm not surprised. I think this was just something that was done by Donald Trump's lawyers to appease him so that it looked as though they were trying to do something, but it was all a big waste of time.
All right, so a Hail Mary pass that stopped short of the end zone. What do you expect from tomorrow's hearing in the classified documents case?
Well, I think this is actually going to be the more interesting one because Judge Aileen Cannon is really on the spot here. A lot of people have questioned whether she can be fair and impartial. I think she's going to show that she is. I think that the Trump people, though, have actually tried to move her much the same way they tried before with the special counsel issue, with trying to put in the special master, rather, by appealing to the idea that this is an unusual situation. We've got a former president, and under these circumstances, we need more transparency, and special circumstances should apply to the guy who's now the leading candidate for the Republican nomination. The fact of the matter is none of that is proper in terms of giving a no trial date, just leaving it up in limbo. The fact of the matter is, just as Jack Smith set forth in his memo, the speedy trial provision of the Constitution not only applies to the defendant, but it also applies to the government and to the public and their right to have a fast resolution of this matter. I mean, if you look at each of the items that Trump has attacked, he really doesn't come up with any facts whatsoever that really counter the very careful schedule that Jack Smith put out there leading up to a trial date of December 11th. There's nothing in that the Trump people or the NADA people attacked at all.
So can we talk a little bit about Jack Smith, Nick? He's linked, not only has he pushed back forcefully on this request to delay the trial until after the election, he's now laying out terms for how these classified documents will be treated over the course of this trial. What will happen if Donald Trump goes on TV and starts talking or just blabbing as he is wont to do?
Well, I mean, under the terms of this order, which is a very standard order, whenever the Department of Justice brings cases that involve classified documents, that he can be held in contempt. And what does contempt mean? It means that the judge could wind up putting the contemptor in jail, in prison. It means that the judge could fine the person. It's a pretty heavy hammer here. Now, the question is whether or not any judge really wants to put Donald Trump in contempt or put him in jail prior to the time that 12 citizens find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of a crime. I mean, look at what Donald Trump...
Don't let talk...
I mean, look at what Donald Trump did in Manhattan with the judge there and talking about the judge and talking about witnesses. I just think that Donald Trump is going to get away with a little bit more than most defendants only because all of these judges are leery to do anything until such time that Donald Trump is convicted.
Nick Ackerman, Donald Trump keeps taking up all of the air in the room. We didn't even get to talk about Rudy Giuliani, but thank you so much for breaking all of that down as we get ready for this pretrial hearing tomorrow. Still ahead, amid attacks on LGBTQ rights, I'm going to be joined by Jim Obergefell, who led the fight for same-sex marriage. Plus, Ron DeSantis fires staffers as he faces a cash crunch. But first, some Democrats are sounding the alarm about a spoiler candidate who could trip up Joe Biden. I'll talk to Cedric Lichman, the newly selected co-chair of Biden's re-election campaign. I want to get to some news that broke just a few hours ago. An Iowa state court judge temporarily blocked a 6-week abortion ban in the state. Last Friday, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds signed a law that would ban abortions at 6 weeks, a point at which few women even know that they are pregnant. Abortion rights advocates immediately filed suit seeking a preliminary injunction that would prevent the law from going into effect while its constitutionality is being litigated. And today, a judge granted that request, putting the law on ice until the legal challenge is resolved. The move restores abortion access up to 20 weeks in the Hawkeye state. Now to Democratic primary politics, and Senator Joe Manchin today dodging questions about whether he'll run for president.
Are you considering running for president on the no-labels third-party ticket?
We're not considering anything about running for any office right now.
Are you taking it off the table? So how will you determine whether to run for president or not?
This is not about running. I'm not in that.
But it's an outstanding question.
It'll be next year.
Manchin's dodge comes as some Democrats fear a potential primary challenger or a third-party candidate siphoning support from Joe Biden. Cornel West, the liberal scholar, activist, and former university professor, has already announced his bid. He could peel away some Biden supporters on a Green Party ticket. And polling shows declared Democratic candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has double-digit support in the Democratic primary. It's early days, and that number is well short of President Biden's 65%. But in theory, a bruising battle could chip away at Biden, shaving off a couple of points. Now, Biden does enter campaign season with some good news. Inflation just hit its lowest point in 2 years. The unemployment rate is below 4%. The economy has posted job gains for 30 straight months. Joining me now to discuss all of this is the perfect person. Cedric Richmond, former Democratic congressman and former senior advisor to President Biden. He is not only a Morehouse College alumnus, he has also been announced as the co-chair for President Biden's re-election bid. Cedric, welcome. You just joined the campaign.
Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you. What is the message that you all want to share with Democrats who are curious about some of the primary challengers to Joe Biden?
Well, President Biden will be the Democratic nominee, but what we want them to know is that this president is still focused on them. He never said it was about him or the vice president. He's focused on growing the economy from the middle out, delivering on promises he's made during the campaign, and continuing to meet the challenges that we face. So let's just, if we need to revisit, united the West against Russia aggression, appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court, created 13.2 million jobs, largest investment in the environment than any other president, actually got infrastructure legislation passed on a bipartisan basis, which no other president did, enacted sensible gun reform legislation, which hasn't been done in almost 30 years. So his record of accomplishments keep going and going. And look, now's the time that we'll start to talk about it. But for the president and the vice president, they're continuing to keep their head down and make life better for Americans and protect those freedoms that are so important.
It is an impressive record, more so by the fact that he faced some significant opposition, even among his own party. As you know, Senator Joe Manchin has not always been on board with the president's agenda. What do you make of Senator Manchin refusing to rule out a run for president?
Well, I think that's a lot in the media. Let's just talk about Senator Manchin, who's been a trusted partner of President Biden. He voted for Ketanji Brown Jackson, the American Rescue Plan, helped us with infrastructure, removing 10 million lead pipes from homes so that people don't have to drink contaminated water. I think over the president's first 2 years, or first year, he voted with the president over 80% of the time. So, look, they are partners. And the one thing you know about Senator Manchin, if he's thinking it, he'll say it. And so we're going to continue to work with him because at the end of the day, it's not about Vice President Harris or President Biden. It's about those families that are watching us now who are fighting to make sure that they make ends meet, and we're going to continue to invest in their lives so they prosper.
One of the biggest issues facing Americans right now is the question over reproductive rights. We have seen this Supreme Court roll back reproductive rights. We've seen the court gut affirmative action, and we've seen them roll back LGBTQ protections. What's your message to fed up Democrats who are tired of hearing the president refuse to talk about or contemplate the prospect of serious court reform, including expanding the court?
Well, what I do is remind voters that in 2016, when we had a choice between Hillary Rodham Clinton and Donald Trump, a lot of people said that Hillary wasn't good enough or that they wanted to cast a protest vote. And so what it does is highlight the danger of third-party candidates that would make a difference in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona, because it was Donald Trump that put 3 very conservative justices on the bench that rolled back all kinds of rights. And so you're talking about reproductive rights, the rights for women to control their own bodies, if you talk about affirmative action. So it only highlights how important the presidency of the United States is. So if you look at President Biden's appointment, Ketanji Brown Jackson versus Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, then you see the difference and you see what's at stake in this election.
And to be very clear, not only has President Biden appointed Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, he's done an amazing job stocking the lower federal courts with new judges as well. But why doesn't that interest in the federal judiciary extend to this question of court reform, which is really on the minds of so many in the progressive wing of the party?
Well, we see how dangerous this court is. And elections have consequences. And so what we would do is continue to remind voters that that's the power of the presidency, and we need to make sure that President Biden gets elected to a second term, because he will continue to appoint judges that display American values. And we've put more public defenders on the bench than anybody else. We've put more women on the appellate court than all other presidents combined. So if you want to know what he's going to do in the future, just look what he's done in the past. And we understand the importance of the Supreme Court.
So I mentioned some good economic numbers at the top. With those good numbers, it stands to reason, why is the president's approval rating still only hovering at around 40%? What's going on here?
Look, I would love to say we sit around and just look at the president's approval ratings. We don't. We focus on those challenges that are facing our American families. And to the extent that there's so much chaos and confusion and division and so many culture wars or so many acts and displays of racism, if you ask me if the mood of the country is in a great place, I would say that the environment itself is very challenging. But as we make our case, I think people will clearly see that we're on the side of uniting this country, moving it forward, and we're going to ignore the noise from all of those who would wish to divide or distract the country. And so 40% is a real number, and I'll take your word at it, but that's just not our focus right now.
Well, Cedric Richmond, thank you so much for coming on here tonight and making the case to the American people.
Well, thank you for having me.
Still ahead, I'll talk to a special guest about the new Supreme Court ruling that could open the floodgates to discrimination. But first, Ron DeSantis is firing staffers and attempting yet another reboot of his campaign. We'll break down what's happening up next. Potential fortunes. The campaign just let go of roughly a dozen staffers, with NBC reporting that the departures were cost-cutting measures. This comes amidst new revelations that DeSantis' campaign has burned through almost $8 million in its first 6 weeks, and that for the first time, quote, solvency could be a threat to the campaign. Crucially, more than 2/3 of DeSantis' funds came from donors who have donated the legal maximum amount and cannot donate again. Aides are now saying that DeSantis will reboot his campaign by focusing on policy, as if that were the problem. DeSantis will also reportedly seek out more interviews with mainstream media outlets, what he calls hostile environments. Joining me now to discuss Ron DeSantis and his campaign is Alencia Johnson, activist and former advisor to the Obama and Biden campaigns. She's also the founder of 1063 West Broad, a social impact agency. Alencia, Ron DeSantis is firing staffers and running short on cash. What's the tea?
Well, look, Ron DeSantis actually fumbled his what would have been a comfortable second place position in the Republican primary. And the reality is voters are not engaging with him in the way that one would hope. You know, you talked about it, the numbers here, that he's firing staffers, and that's because they overstaffed, they overcommitted. Right? They had a great campaign haul in the first quarter, in the first few weeks. However, they're not able to sustain that. And so they've got to actually make sure that they're able to even make it until the first primary vote. But you alluded at something that's even more troubling. Look, Ron DeSantis' policies are the policies of the Republican Party, this culture wars. He is the culture war leader. It's not his policies that will get like him. It is his personality. He is not a likable person. And the more that he banks on that being his strategy to talk to voters, I actually feel like his approval numbers will continue to go down, and it will only be a worst case scenario for him.
Well, you've hit on the same question that I had. It doesn't seem like it's the policy. The policy is not the problem, but the personality might be. What is it about his personality that conservative voters are finding so unappealing, unattractive?
Well, it's so interesting. I'm clearly not a conservative voter, but when you look at someone like Ron DeSantis, he's not flailing out here like a Donald Trump, who, one would say has a horrible personality, but he does have the charisma to connect emotionally with a base of the Republican Party. Mike Pence, he connects with evangelicals. Chris Christie probably connects with voters who are tired of the Donald Trumps of the world. Ron DeSantis can't even figure out who he wants to be. Ron DeSantis can't figure out who he wants to attack, whether it's going to be his primary opponents or if he's going to go on a homophobic and transphobic rant and spending all of this money on an ad that was something that we actually did not need to see. And so it's kind of hard for voters to see who he is beyond this person that they just cannot get behind and they cannot like. I mean, if you look at the guy, he walks around kind of like he's angry and doesn't even want to be in the position that he's in. He lambasts at even Fox News, right? So I don't even know how these media interviews are going to do well for him if he wants voters to like him, which is, as we know, a key piece of making it in presidential politics. You can govern as well as you want to. You can be a great, quote-unquote, organizer, but if people don't like you, you're not going to make it that far.
Well, you hit on a key problem here. Fox News can make or break a Republican candidate. And the Washington Post is reporting that Rupert Murdoch used to be excited about DeSantis, at least at the beginning. But the more he shows himself, the less appealing he is. Is DeSantis in danger of losing Fox News and hence losing the primary itself?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you can't get Fox News to stay on your side, I mean, that is literally the RNC's mouthpiece. If you cannot get on Fox News' side, then there's really no hope for voters to engage with you. There's no hope for, the establishment in the Republican Party to want to rally behind you or even just say, hey, I'm going to hold out my support on Donald Trump and see how DeSantis is going to do. But it's a sad day when even Murdoch is saying that he doesn't even care for DeSantis anymore when, again, he was crowned as the guy who was going to take Donald Trump out and, quote unquote, save the Republican Party. And here we are talking about this balloon that has been extremely deflated very easily.
You hate to see it. Alessia Johnson, thanks so much for coming on The Beat to talk about it all.
Thank you.
Up next, a special guest on how Supreme Court conservatives are scaling back LGBTQ rights. Stay with us. Today's wave of attacks on LGBTQ rights seemed unthinkable just 8 years ago when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage.
This morning, the breaking story just moments ago, the Supreme Court and this landmark ruling, the court making same-sex legal, same-sex marriage legal in this country.
Celebrations erupted on the steps of the Supreme Court right after the decision was handed down.
We have read from the bench, there is a right to marriage equality.
Millions of Americans felt joy and relief after that ruling, a vindication of decades of struggle. But now, a different Supreme Court has issued a different ruling, one that threatens to drag America backwards. Last month, the conservative supermajority ruled that the First Amendment protects a web designer's decision to refuse to work on same-sex weddings. Some businesses are viewing this ruling as a license to discriminate. In Michigan, a hair salon owner is facing an investigation by city officials after she announced that she would refuse service to transgender customers. And in Indiana, an appeals court ruled that a Catholic school can fire a guidance counselor because of her same-sex marriage. And in Texas, a judge is citing the Supreme Court's ruling as justification for her refusal to perform same-sex ceremonies. The liberal justices on the court warned that this would happen. Moreover, they warned that it would open the door to discrimination against other groups of Americans.
I don't know that we can say that just because we have a religious objection to same-sex marriage in this situation that wouldn't necessarily implicate religious objections to other kinds of situations.
Where's the line? I choose to serve whom I want if I disagree with their personal characteristics like race or disability. I can choose not to sell to those people.
All of this, despite recent polling showing that a majority of Americans support laws that protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. Joining me now is Jim Obergefell, the plaintiff in the landmark Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage. Jim, welcome. What is your reaction?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, delighted to have you, Jim. I haven't seen you since we testified before Congress a couple of years ago. What's your reaction to this new ruling? Some have said that this does no more than vindicate the religious freedom of those who have reasonable objections to same-sex marriage. Do you disagree?
I disagree wholeheartedly. My concern is that this ruling opens the door for discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community and potentially others. If a business that's open to the public can wrap their religious persecution of others up in free speech, then what is to stop them from refusing service to an interracial couple, to anyone else whom for whatever reason upsets or bothers that business owner? This is opening the door to something that this country is not supposed to be about.
So, Jim, right now, this decision deals with state-level public accommodations laws that prevent discrimination on the basis of certain characteristics, including sexual orientation. There is no federal law that prohibits sexual orientation discrimination. Is a federal law needed to protect the LGBTQ community from this kind of discrimination, or are there other measures that we can take given the polarization in Congress?
We absolutely need a federal law to prevent this, to protect the LGBTQ plus community. We exist. We are human beings. We do not choose to be who we are. We simply are who we are. The only choice we make is to live our truth openly and honestly. We deserve protections like any other minority group in this country so that we can not be fired, so that we can get service in a business that's open to the public, so that we can have apartments, so that we can do everything that every other person in this country is supposed to be able to do. And when some minority groups are protected and others aren't, that is a recipe for disaster. And that is exactly what we're seeing.
Some predicted that this day would come. Last year, when Roe versus Wade was overturned, Justice Thomas wrote in his concurring opinion that the court should, quote, reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Obergefell. Do you think that this court is prepared to take the dramatic step of overturning the gay marriage case that bears your name?
I hate to say it, but yes, I do. This is a Supreme Court that's dominated by extreme right-wing justices. And when one of those justices puts a target on marriage equality, the right to intimate relations in the privacy of your own home, the right to birth control, he put a target on those decisions in his concurrence in the Dobbs decision. That was a clear call to opponents of marriage equality, opponents of LGBTQ plus equality across the country to start gearing up to file these suits, to do everything they can to tell us that we do not belong in We the People. So I very much am afraid that this court could overturn Obergefell v. Hodges. And it used to be that we could say the Supreme Court believes in precedent, and they are loath to overturn precedent. Well, they proved that wrong with their decision in Dobbs. They overturned abortion rights, almost 50-year precedent. Marriage equality, only 8 years. So our right to marry, our right to commit to the person we love and to form our families is in serious risk in this nation.
Jim Obergefell, it's a dire set of circumstances across